Good evening and welcome to MTSO's Theological Commons event. Tonight's panel is a pre-recorded panel due to the authors being spread all over the world in different time zones. You will be able to speak with two of the authors, MTSO's Dr. Yvonne Zimmerman and Dr. Lauren McGraw, who is in Australia, at the end of the pre-recorded time. You may enter questions in the Q&A box and they will get to what they can get to in the time that we have. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting us to be here today with the Theological Commons. We're going to start with a brief introduction of today's panelists. I'm Letitia Campbell. I'm on the faculty at Candler School of Theology in Atlanta, Georgia. We also have today Yvonne Zimmerman, who is on the faculty at the Methodist Theological School of Ohio. She is Associate Professor of Christian Ethics and Associate Academic Dean. Thanks for being here. Hannah Estabrook is a professional clinical counselor and has worked with survivors of the sex trade for over a decade. She runs a nonprofit called Sanctuary Night in Columbus, Ohio. And that organization offers drop-in services for those still in the life. Thanks for being here, Hannah. Anna Perkins is a Jamaican Roman Catholic researcher at the University of the West Indies and at the International Research, at St. Michael's Theological College in Kingston, Jamaica. She is currently the scholar in residence at the Center for African Studies at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. Thanks for being here. And then last but not least, we have Lauren McGraw, who is the editor of this volume. Lauren is a research fellow at Charles Sturt University in Australia and is the author of Missionary Positions, a post-colonial feminist perspective on sex work and faith-based outreach from Australia. Thank you so much. Lauren, I'd like to start with you and invite you and Yvonne to talk a little bit about how this collection came to be.
Yes, well, it was many years ago now, Yvonne. Yvonne was one of my PhD examiners, I think in 2014, perhaps. You read my thesis and passed my work and also gave me some amazing feedback, and you posed a question to me because my work was highly critical of what was happening in this space. And you said something like, we can criticize, but what are the new practices that we need to sort of outline and discuss and think about? And so that question really stayed with me over the years, and I stalked Yvonne online and found out what an amazing woman she was, and I couldn't resist emailing her to see if Yvonne, if you were going to the American Academy of Religion conference in Denver in, I think it was 2018, perhaps. And you were. And that's how it began. Do you remember that, Yvonne?
I do. That is how it began. And at the time, I was otherwise overcommitted. And so I wasn't, because you had said that you had this idea for a book and you wanted to talk possibly with me and also Letitia about collaborating. And at the time I, wasn't able to go all the way in, but was totally interested in this idea that you had about putting together a collection of sort of religious responses to sex work and sex trafficking, but that were progressive voices and sex positive voices, and that were not necessarily working out of a perspective that understood commercial sex work as inherently sinful. Which has been the dominant perspective of many Christian faith-based anti-trafficking organizations. So we met in Denver. And we
We
had lots of
did.
conversations about this book. And I know that that's where you began meeting with some publishers. And I believe Letitia was involved with those conversations too. And
yeah, and Routledge, were really supportive and understanding and right there for this work. And every step of the way, they were asking really great questions and really pursuing this book. And that opened up with them in just a really clear way. I've actually found them to be great to publish with. So yeah, my initial idea was that we would get a special issue in a journal, but somehow we managed to, work it into a collection. I think that the question that was sitting in the back of my mind, because I'd been working in this space for many years and had started writing in it, and as many people have told me over the years, it's an unusual sort of thing to be thinking and writing about. I wanted to know how many scholars were out there in the world who were thinking and writing in a similar way. And I just had this instinct that there were enough of us who are not entirely aligned, but we're sitting together in a conversation here, that we could do something together. So really for me, it was also about building that international network of scholars and practitioners who are taking the perspective that you've just outlined, Yvonne. Turns out there is an international network of enough scholars who are, working in this field.
sure. And there were some bumps along the way because, of course, one of the things that we were not able to anticipate in 2018 and moving into 2019 was the pandemic that awaited us in 2020 and the following years. And so there were some years in there where kind of felt like work on this particular book had stalled. I mean, I think I speak for many of us about during particularly, the first year or so of COVID, like getting through the day was its own accomplishment, let alone trying to produce scholarship as part of what getting through the day involved. At least for me, that was not part of it. And so, and then of course, as we began to come out on the other side, a lot of pieces of the world have been rearranged since then. So COVID, I think, also changed the book or impacted the book in certain ways.
Yeah. Agreed, it did. It helped refine the book, perhaps, in some ways, in terms of who was left standing and was going to be a part of this. But it has also shifted the dynamic in terms of sex trafficking and sex work, possibly globally. So yeah, we were able to reflect a little bit on that in our chapters. But I think because it's been published while this is ongoing, obviously it speaks from a particular moment.
Yeah, thank you so much for just giving us that short introduction to the gestation of the book. And I think, do you have a hard copy of it with you, Lauren?
I do. Yeah.
Okay, well, I just wanted you to hold it up for the camera because I do think wonderful. It's worth celebrating that this book, several of you have hard copies. I have the e-copy. But it's worth celebrating that this book exists in the world, both in electronic versions that can be accessed really widely and in hard copy. This is really the first collection that I am aware of that brings together scholars from such a broad set of geographical locations, as well as disciplinary backgrounds, to reflect on this intersection of religious responses to sex work and sex trafficking. So I think it makes a great contribution to the field just by its very existence and the kind of conversations that it sets up. And that is something to celebrate, especially because it involved so much persistence in the face of the pandemic. And I'll be interested, maybe other people will have things to add about the way that the pandemic and its long tail have shaped and reshaped even some of the phenomena that you're writing about. Since it is such a broad collection, I want to start our time together by just having each of you speak for a few minutes about your chapter and introduce us to what you're writing about, who you're writing about and learning alongside in that chapter, and some of the key contributions that your work is making to this conversation and to the work that is growing out of it. I'm actually going to move through those of us who are here in the order of the table of contents. So Hannah, I'll ask you first to talk some about your chapter. Do you see this woman, lessons learned from sex workers?
Yeah, thank you so much. So first of all, I just want to say that I somehow got involved in this project, I think because I too was one of Yvonne's stalkers. So I just wanted to say I have solidarity with Lauren. I'm so encouraged to know I'm not the only one. But anyway, and likely that I benefited from somebody else who probably dropped out. And I'm just thrilled to be a part of this book and a part of this conversation. That being said, do you see this woman, which is a phrase that comes from a passage in the Bible in Luke chapter 7. And it's the story of the woman who anointed the feet of Jesus. And there's some debate about this, but some people have suggested that the woman who anoints the feet of Jesus, it was a sex worker of some kind. It's unclear, I would say. However, what I have found is that, there's something orienting for me about that story. In even that question, do you see this woman? I think it has something to offer the conversation we're having. But I would say the chapter sort of tracks in some ways my own evolution from working with this population directly for many years in the court system. And what was happening in the court system was that the progressive ones within that environment were saying that the best way to help women in the sex trade in our city was to arrest them. And in some ways, they weren't wrong because the resources available it's just a very well-resourced, it's kind of like the police. I mean, it's just, there's so much funding, so many resources that are diverted to the criminal justice system. And so if a woman would opt into this particular program in our court system called Catch Court, then lots of things would be made available to them for being able to get on their own feet in a different direction. So that's, fine, but I got really tired of that being sort of the ceiling of our imagination. And it seemed to me that there should be an opportunity, I think, that honors agency of individuals involved in the sex trade, that doesn't involve the coercion of a jail or a judge or a prosecutor. And so my personal evolution then led me to open a drop-in center and work with more individuals on the street, which opened conversations for me, not just with women involved in the sex trade, but also with partners, with buyers, with men. And particularly because of COVID, that was one of the gifts for me personally of COVID, was that I ended up having more conversations with men. And I guess really importantly, what I learned was that in this sort of rescue industrial complex that I think is given a lot of voice already throughout even the chapters in this book. I think there's a really robust and appropriate critique of how some of the, evangelical faith-based organizations have actually maintained the marginalization and maintained the oppression for people involved in the sex trade. And what I think that I would also say is that I started to see how in that sort of victim mentality, there was the creation of what I call in this chapter a new monster. And that monster is the buyer of sex, and I have been there, actually. I should say that, that I spent years really demonizing men and purchasers or managers of sex. And I lacked any kind of imagination for the image of God in these individuals until I, A, began to have relationship with them personally, and B, started listening to actual sex workers talk about those men. Really importantly. And what I learned is that their gaze was much more compassionate, and that they saw themselves very much in some of these men. And I think the question then of, do you see this woman, sort of flips around to also saying, you know, Jesus in that story is clearly trying to demonstrate compassion to this woman who is a quote unquote known sinner. But I think what is also true is that his heart was to restore and invite Simon into the Pharisee, into the beloved community, because there was something that Jesus could see in Simon that maybe is hard to see for some of us who are accustomed to creating an enemy in our minds when there's a victim. So that was probably too long of a summary, but that's what my chapter is about.
Thank you so much. I can see that the challenging part of this part of the panel is that we're going to move through all the chapters and not get to talk more right away about each one. Yvonne, your chapter, A Catholic and an Agnostic Walk into a Homeless Camp, Collaborating Across Religious Differences. I would love to hear you talk a little bit. It sounds like there's a story out of which this chapter grows.
There is, actually. So the first thing I want to say is that this chapter was originally a keynote address at the University of Sheffield about 3 years ago at the Rights, Dignity, and Religion Responding to Modern Slavery conference. But the content for that talk grew out of some research I was doing actually with you, Letitia, about 5 or so years ago, where we were researching anti-trafficking organizations or adjacent organizations. In other words, they may not necessarily frame their work as anti-trafficking, but they were providing services and support to folks who were at least vulnerable to exploitation, perhaps rising to the level of human trafficking. And we had done some research about a harm reduction organization in Denver, Colorado, that served youth. And this was particularly of interest at the time because I think that, again, I'll say I think the landscape, at least in the US, has changed somewhat since then. But at the time, there was not a whole lot of harm reduction work being done around sex work and human trafficking, and certainly not with minors. So whatever was being done, like it was that was sort of tacitly understood as an adult intervention. So I was interested in this organization, but as is often the case in this particular landscape, which is like moving and changing for a lot of different reasons all the time, this organization had actually closed its doors and was no longer functioning. So in that sense, I couldn't go visit the organization anymore, but I could find the former executive director, and she agreed to speak with us. And so Letitia, it was in 2018, I believe, Letitia and I went out to Denver and we did some interviews with her, and she was super engaging. She was working for another anti-trafficking organization, but was still talking about some of the sort of informal work that she continued to do kind of under the umbrella of the organization she was with at the time, and sort of also on her own, because she had developed these friendships and relationships with these youth and young people. And so just because the organization closed didn't mean the relationships ended, right? So she continued to be in contact with them. And in the course of the conversation, talked a lot about sort of the, again, informal volunteering she was doing with a friend of hers who was the executive director of a Catholic ministry called the Denver Homeless Ministry. And it became clear in the conversation that these two women were just about as different, ideologically speaking, as it would be possible to be. So Mary, the woman who was with the the former harm reduction organization for youth, at least at the time identified as agnostic, was very much into harm reduction, and sort of had I'm not sure, she was not, there was no sex negativity, no, while she understood that involvement in the commercial sex trade made youth and young people very vulnerable to exploitation, she wasn't making the argument that selling sex is inherently exploitative and harmful, and recognized that that was oftentimes a survival strategy that youth were using and that their agency needed to be supported. Tanya from the Denver Homeless Ministry was a Catholic lay person, but very devoted to the Catholic Church and the Catholic Church's teachings, not necessarily when and so including its morality around sex and the place of sex within marriage, that is sort of the common and dominant line of Christian sexual morality. And yet, they had become friends through their shared work, because of course, many of the people that the Denver Homeless Ministry was serving are also people, they're predominantly, although not exclusively, young, and at high risk for all kinds of different types of exploitation. So they found out they were serving the same populations. And so they would go into the homeless camp in Denver's Central City Park and go out, and they would hand out food and socks and gloves and information and all kinds of things. So they had this vibrant partnership together. And I got really curious about that because, like I said, they were just about as different as they could be. And so I wanted to talk with them together, because what I wanted to find out is like, what makes this tick? Because it seemed to me that that could be, so they had figured out how to make that work in a way that was pretty unique, and that I knew that I wanted to understand better. So I went out and also got to do another interview with both of them again, got to go with them into the homeless camp, walk around and see what they did. And so what I tried to do in this chapter was to identify what it is that, again, like made this partnership work. So some of the themes that I came up with was friendship, mutual respect, trust, relational intelligence, and boundaries. And so I think the contribution of this chapter to the conversation is about helping organizations think about the kinds of partnerships they will develop strategically, and that an effective partnership does not necessarily require ideological similarity, which I think was my assumption, is that a successful partnership would require ideological similarity. And so I was really surprised to find out that that is not always the case. And so to think about what kinds of things need to be in place to make it work.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a great example and really great learnings that you were able to hear in that story to draw out. Lauren, you have a chapter entitled Towards an Ethical Framework for Practice, 3 Touchstones for Faith-Based Organizations at the Margins. And you're also drawing out some lessons or guides for faith-based organizations in this work. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that chapter.
Yeah, thank you, Letitia. This chapter came from an experience that I had here in Australia, again in 2018. I'd been examining a number of the faith-based organisations in Australia that do this work. At the time, there were 9 organisations. And I'd done some interviews with them and been to visit different ones and looked at their practices. And as I began to talk to the people in these organisations and tell them what I was doing, they were very curious about the other organisations, and it turned out none of them knew each other, yet they were all working in a very similar space. So I tendered for a grant to bring them all together for 3 days of meet and greet and, you know, professional development and a bit of fun. So about 11 or 12 people came together from across the nation, and because they didn't know each other's organisations, every person there did a bit of a presentation about the work they were doing with sex workers in Australia. And for me, I didn't do any presentations. I just got to sit and listen to all these people speak over a few days. I was like a pig in mud, actually. It was so good for me. But as I was sitting there reflecting on everyone speaking, I could see themes coming through really distinctively. And that just got me thinking about, you know, bringing these professionals together. They were really challenging each other and speaking to each other and setting their standards. And I know that this is such an unusual space to work in, and we haven't thought a lot about what are the best practices here. Because I did become aware as I was listening to them talk that a number of organisations have actually thought through this complexity a lot more than others, and yet trying to work in that space, which Hannah alluded to before, that, you know, the rescue, the good and the bad, and really distinct binary ways of working is just really difficult and can be really unhelpful and even abusive at times. So I felt like, can we think more about best practices and ethical values and sort of put down on paper what emerged from that getting together? It wasn't as easy to get this down on paper. Even now, I'm not even sure what I've written in a way. I guess they are values or ethics or spiritual openness, sort of thing that is reflected in practices. What I could see with the organisations in Australia is that the issues they faced when working with the women in the sex industry was great stigma, both that the women experience, but also practitioners, you know, experience as well, and the organisations do too. You do carry the stigma in multiple ways. And then the second sort of issue they were wrestling with in working with women was complexity. So that balance between agency and oppression and just life circumstances and the structures that surround human beings. And then the third sort of issue or something that needed to be addressed was power, the power imbalance of, you know, white people working with Aboriginal sex workers and people with money in projects working with people on the streets, and just how does that dynamic, how is that interacting, and, you know, are we talking about that? So those sort of themes were just named again and again, and listening to people in the organisations in Australia talk about how they address those themes, I could see that what they were doing to address them, well, the first one, stigma, was to create safe spaces. So to be with women in a way that was really just grounded and based on the concept of home. So I take a broad view of that and analyse a bit what home means and how that creates safety and challenges stigma. Because if you have a sense of home within yourself and with others and in society, it does help sort of push back stigma. And how you address complexity was the second issue. And I took a sort of left of field approach to that maybe, you know, life is so serious and complex many times. And part of the rescue narrative that really, you know, that doesn't work for me is how serious life is. And that often when you spend time with women in the sex industry, it's really playful time. You know, it's not always about sex work, is it? It's about having fun together and just being human. And I could see that a lot of that occurs within the organisations in Australia. and then an analysis of what it means to share power. And I think that I'm just starting to work into that field a bit more, because I do think that entails a radical rethink of how faith-based organisations work with very marginalised people. My chapter is analysing the issues and then addressing them through some of these, I guess I would call them values or ethics or just spiritual openness, that can then be reflected in the actual practices on the ground. I think another thing that comes out of my chapter, and I only realised it at the end, is that many of the most organisations in Australia who are doing this sort of work and other work with homeless people are faith-based and religious organisations, and there's 5 key organisations in Australia. They're very religious and they're getting a lot of government funding as well. So there's this odd dynamic that they are presenting themselves as secular, and yet behind the scenes they are very religious. And I sort of saw a gap there and want to help them sort of shrink that gap a bit, so there's a little more integration. So that's something that came out of my chapter as well.
Thank you for that introduction. Anna, your chapter, Jesus Ate with Pross, Christianity and Commercial Sex Work in the Caribbean. I'm intrigued by your work, and I'd love to hear you just give us a brief glimpse into this chapter.
Sure, Letitia, thank you so much. I think it might have been somewhere 2018, 2019, somebody sent me an email that Lauren had sent out about the project. And I think they sent it to me because they knew that I wasn't going to be afraid to transgress some of these spaces, because I'd already been doing work on and critiquing the church's response to people who are gender minorities. I also worked alongside Dane, and Dane's my co-author on the chapter. He's not here with us, but Dane's a gay Jamaican man that has done a lot of work with LGBT people in Jamaica. He headed one of our major LGBT organizations for about 10 years and so on. So he's done a lot of HIV and AIDS work and so on. And I've been partnering in different ways as an ally, but also in tandem with that, doing a bit of writing and researching and critiquing and being vocal in my own way, sort of challenging how church looks at sex and sexuality, and then how the church contributes to, in a lot of ways, the oppression of gender minority people in Jamaica and across the Caribbean. In fact, just a couple of months ago, I was asked to write a brief for a case that's going through the courts in one of the islands in the Caribbean around removing the Buggery law and so on. So I've been involved in that particular way. So I don't even remember who it was, but the person said, you know, I'm sure this is something Anna would be interested in, and they forwarded it to me. And then I got in touch with Lauren. And Lauren, I have to thank you in a very special way, because you've been particularly supportive in the process and just pulling out of us the best ways to do what we were being called upon to do. Because while I'd done a lot of stuff on gender minorities, and I had interacted with women in particular who have been involved as sex workers, and, you know, my interest was there, but it just sort of opened up more with this invitation, because then I had to ask myself some questions, you know. And so I heard some of it coming out from what Yvonne said, and even what Hannah said. You know, as a Roman Catholic, I do have a perspective that's been shaped about where sex sits and how can sex be a commodity to be exchanged in the market and so on. So this was an opportunity to engage in a conversation with myself, a conversation with a colleague, friend such as Dane. Really, what's going on? What are the churches doing? What are they saying? And then, of course, the pandemic came along, and then opportunities to have conversations with sex workers became nil. But then I understood a different way too, the reality of the sex work, and then could do a little bit of work in that direction, particularly because they were so exposed. So what was happening is that governments were struggling in the Caribbean. How do we support people who are legitimately working but have been prevented from working because of the pandemic? So they could give grants, but sex workers weren't part of the formal economy, so they couldn't be assisted, and that was forcing them into deeper poverty and not being able to take care of their families. So I found myself doing a little bit of research, and I even did another piece that incorporated how we looked at those particular bodies. So what Dana and I were trying to do in this chapter was really just to wrestle with what was going on in terms of how church entered, and particularly vocal segments of the church entered the conversation around sex work, around whether it should be legalized. How do you view a sex work? And we recognized a couple of things. So for example, sex work is very gendered in the Caribbean. So even though men are sex workers, and we have a whole strata of men who are involved in the tourism industry. You may have heard of, what we call rent-a-dreads, or I learned another word from Kai Miller, one of Jamaica's foremost young poets the other day. He called them rastitutes, because there's something about wearing the locks and how attractive that is to women tourists coming down and so on. But also to that gender minority members of our community were involved in sex work as well, because that was actually a space of freedom, that they could be themselves and they could earn money to take care of themselves and their families. So it was really a complex space, and it really challenged me. I know it challenged Dana as well, as we try to understand what that space looked like and why the voices of the men and women, including trans women who are involved in that space, had been so muted. And part of the reason had to do with how our space was so Christian shaped, and how that has said that sex outside of marriage, adultery, sex work, all of that's immoral. So this woman needs to be converted. Lauren, I think you use terms like she needs to be rescued, or if you don't rescue her, you reject her, And Hannah, that whole story of Jesus and the woman, the anointing woman from Luke chapter 7 was also a part of our conversation as well, just as the statement that Jesus made in Matthew's gospel. He says, these public sinners will get into heaven before all of you who think that you're so fabulous and so righteous, but these public sinners will actually get there in front of you. Why? So, that was part of what Dana and I were thinking through and wrestling with, and asking if there might not be other ways of reading those stories and interpreting those stories that would be more compassionate towards the persons involved in sex work as sex work, and whether there's not a need for us to look at it as work, so it should be legitimized in the legal framework of Jamaica and other spaces in the Caribbean. And I like Hannah's point about the monster and how she herself at a point had framed the Johns and the people who were procuring and the people who were facilitating as these monsters. And there are monsters involved in the space, but those are not the only people who are there. And how do we respond in ways that are much more compassionate, ways that allow persons who are involved in sex work by choice to have more of a voice in how their work is framed, what laws are shaped in terms of what they're doing and so on. And because the Christian community has such a large presence in both discussing and rejecting and even serving, so we want to argue Jesus had a different way. Jesus said, come. He didn't say you have to give up sex work in order to be one of my apostles or my disciples. So what's going on there? Why do they have to leave it behind before they can be members of the community, and what's really going on there? So that's some of what we were trying to do in our piece, and we enjoy doing it. And Yvonne, we were involved in another space with you, trying to enlarge the conversation too, because this seeing sex work and human trafficking, sex trafficking as one and the same has complexified what's going on. So the government finds it easy to go after sex workers, and they can tick some boxes and say, hey, look, America, you've been saying we've not been paying attention to human trafficking, soft targets. And that's where they've been going. And that's been making the lives of our sex workers even more difficult. We know what happens with them, with the police, where the police are a source of oppression against sex workers in our Jamaican/Caribbean space as well. But I leave it there for further conversation.
Thank you so much, Anna. And actually, we've been joined by another contributor to the volume, Beatrice Okere Manu. Thank you so much for joining us. Beatrice is joining us from South Africa, and her presence actually illustrates one of the challenges of doing this kind of international volume. South Africa has been experiencing rolling blackouts and intermittent lack of electricity. So she's been trying to join us, and we're really thrilled that you're here. Beatrice is a senior lecturer at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa and the International Research Training Group with a focus on transformative religion. So thanks for being here. We are just in the process of inviting each contributor to say a little bit about their chapter and give the audience a little glimpse of your research. So Beatrice, I know you worked with several other colleagues on a chapter, When Survival Precedes Faith, Decolonial Perspectives on the Ethical Dilemma Confronting Female Christian Sex Workers in Africa. And I know this work is a multinational project, so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the chapter and the research out of which it grew.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for having me here. Yeah, thank you. It's amazing because I was really, in fact, I crossed my fingers. And yeah, because unfortunately today I have not even seen electricity. I went to campus, nothing happened. I came home, the lights were off, but I'm here now. So thank you so much for having me. Yes, the chapter, our chapter, we were three who did a chapter. Myself, Dr. Sophie Chirongoma, she couldn't also be here because of electricity. And then Dr. Maggie Sebunya. She's currently in Uganda and we didn't hear from her. So I'm here now. So we were three friends who decided, we met, okay, I know Dr. Chirongoma, and then Maggie was my student, my PhD student, and we went for a conference. So I'm just giving a background to the whole chapter. So we went to a conference and we went for dinner in town, Johannesburg. And on our way back, we saw a number of people standing. So the conversation started from there. However, my master's dissertation was also in this area, sex work, and livelihood, yeah. So we had a long chat. So it became important that we look at this work from different countries in Africa, just to compare, compare notes and all that. So that evening, we planned the project, and the project had been going for 2 years. So originally, I'm from Ghana, but living in Pietermaritzburg in South Africa. So I took 2 research areas, and Sophie is from Zimbabwe, so she decided to look at it from the Harare context, and Maggie also did it from Kampala. So, we interviewed about 100 participants, all from lower socioeconomic background. And most of them just had, primary education. And as a result of that, looking for employment was very difficult, has been difficult for them. So to them, this is an opportunity, to survive. And is the easiest form of work anybody can do. Now, the interesting part is that we really wanted to know their religious background. And I don't know, but all of them claim to be Christians, and who they go to church, and they understand the teaching of the Bible. However, if they have to survive without any form of proper education to enable them to find what we call proper jobs, then this is the easiest option for them. And it was very interesting, doing this ethnographic study, because it came out a whole lot. We had a lot of data. So at a point, we didn't even know which one to take out and which one to, where people believe that positively it is helping them survive. Of course, not all of them are in because of poverty. Some just the experience of it. People who have completed school, and others also who say that they do this as part-time when they have their own jobs, but when the going get tough, this is what they choose to do. And and one participant really challenged me, because she posed a question to say that, okay, I know you are also a Christian and all that. What if you are in my shoes and you have children and there's no food on the table? What will you do? So she was asking me what I would have done in this situation. And when it came to the question about the Christian church, the church, and what they are doing, how they see the two, it was interesting, because most of them are doing this without the knowledge of everybody, because obviously most of them work at night, so people don't see them. But then they also mention how the church has been discriminatory against such people and all that. So they wouldn't want the church to know what is happening. But this is how they are surviving. So unless the church does something, to benefit them, it's difficult for them to just leave this job. A number of them agreed that they wouldn't want their children to go into it. But at the end of the day, what really came out is that the church needs to do something to women, especially those without proper education, those who cannot be employed, and yet they have children and they need to survive. So I don't know if there are any questions, but generally, this is the work that we did. We are planning to do a follow-up and see what has happened after this work. So this is us.
Thank you so much. I have to say, listening to all of you talk about your contributions to this collection, one thing that I'm really struck by is how thoroughly your work responds to the real lived material conditions in which your communities are living, and that each of you are responding to the very specific contexts that you're living in, writing and researching and working in. So that actually brings me to another kind of question that I had as I was reading this collection, which is really about what are the implications of your work or of this volume as a whole as we think about future directions in advocacy, activism, direct service, and and research. And some of you have mentioned this a bit, but I think as much as you are responding to these lived conditions that are around you, you're also speaking back to them and offering up a mirror in some cases of what may be hidden from certain parts of the power structure, but that you are seeing and witnessing so clearly. So this is an open question for anybody who wants to respond. What are the implications of this work as we think about future directions in advocacy, activism, and research?
I'd like to start with something, Letitia. Just reflecting on my chapter and the journey that I went through to get that chapter, it's meant that I've become much closer to a number of organisations in Australia and have now worked in a bit of advocacy and education and support with particularly two organisations here who I think are doing amazing work. And through that relational development, it turns out that last year, the one organisation that's in the state of Victoria in Australia was invited to participate in a review of the law around the sex industry in that state. And their immediate response to that was to come to me to seek some counsel about their approach that they would take. So having that trusting relationship with them and having worked with them over the years and doing this stuff with them, we were able to really nut out the approach they were going to take. And for the first time in that organisation's 30-year history, they took an approach of decriminalisation of sex work in their state. So I just felt like that was a really big win in Australia in this context. And that has now inspired me, because I don't live in that state, I live elsewhere. And there's been some Christian activism in the state I'm currently living in that is very, very much opposed to legalising the sex industry and taking a more a radical feminist approach here. And so I'm now inspired that maybe I can do a bit more activism in my own state to see some change. So that's the future, and the next couple of years for me is to work on getting some legal change where I'm currently living, hoping to use this resource of the book to do that.
Okay, can I go? Yeah, all right. In all 4 countries, sex work is criminalized. But I must also say that I've had the opportunity after this, because I'm on the board of a theological institution. So, and it's in Pietermaritzburg here. It's in cluster with our school, the theology. So I had a chance to present our findings to first to the lecturers and also to the students who are church leaders on the Christian responses to women involved in this. And it was really well received. In fact, I've gone to 2 places now, 2 institutions to present this. They are all Bible institutions to present this. And it was interesting because there were a lot of questions. Right from the beginning, everybody thought that, oh no, these are sinful people and all that. But to get them understand the conditions that are pushing these women into this industry, I think was also a win. And yeah, we're looking forward, for more conversations around it. I haven't spoken to any law, whatever, and yeah, but at least targeting the church, the pastors and church leaders who are in school now, I think is something that will go a long way. Yeah.
If I can jump in, Beatrice, one of the things, the contributions from your chapter that I really appreciated and continue to appreciate so much, and I wrote a bit about it in the afterword, but I just want to be able to have the opportunity to tell you personally how helpful it has been, is the idea, the notion of complex agency that you discussed in your chapter. About the, and so like and complex agency, I'm reading, again, from there is, the intentional effort to take charge of their lives amidst economic vulnerability, dispossession, and neglect in order to transform their status quo. So this is the idea, not that agency is the ability to rise above or transcend, like, you know, like get out of whatever sort of structural situations are sort of shaping one's life, but that still doesn't make one, reduce one only to the status of a victim who is totally passive, can't resist, all these kinds of things, but the ability to say, like, and again, this gets to the point, Letitia, that you made about the importance of paying such close attention to context, but about people are transforming their status quo, and that the importance of recognizing that for people. And for me, that is, the three of you were able to give voice to something that, like, I had thought about, but I had not been able to name. And so when I read it, it was this immediate recognition of, like, yes, that is exactly it. We need to be able to talk about complex agency. And the interesting thing is, and, you know, this is part of the sadness of not having all of the authors who contributed to this book able to attend. In Carly Daniel Hughes' chapter on Abolition Mamas, she talks about the kinds of constraints on agency that, like, very privileged white women experience and are maybe working out in some of their anti-trafficking initiatives. But I was thinking, like, yes, this notion of complex agency has purchased at various points along sort of structures of privilege and oppression. And sort of this idea of, like, pure freedom and pure agency has been a myth all along. And so I just wanted to thank you for that particular offering in this chapter. I know that's like a tiny sliver of a much richer offering that you gave, but that idea, I think the way you lifted that up for the folks who participated in your study is a real gift. I'll speak for myself, to me, but I think that is a concept that I think is really helpful to the larger conversation.
Thank you.
I look forward to reading Beatrice's chapter, and I thank Yvonne for flagging that whole notion of complex agency, because I do think it does go a long way to describing some of what's happening with the men and women involved in sex work in Jamaica and across the Caribbean, and obviously in lots of other spaces across the world. For me, one of the challenges of doing this kind of research and having it published and so on is entering into conversations with people who are deeply Christian and who believe that I'm not Christian. In fact, that I am preaching immorality by even daring to suggest that a woman could choose sex work, not by force, that, you know, this is something she enjoys doing. This is part of how she contributes to shaping the world. This is how she contributes to the life and livelihood of her children and her family. And how do you get out of being pigeonholed and backed up into a space that your conversation partners don't even want to hear your first word, because any discussion of sex work, straight up prostitution, because I try to reframe every time I have a conversation. It's not prostitution. There's too much stigma. There's too much tying in with immorality there. And we have to look at how we think about things like adultery and same-sex interactions and so on. But immediately you get pigeonholed and you get abused. It's it's a part of that whole challenge that I have. I know that I will write something in the popular media, you know, in our newspapers or something that I distill the research, because I recognize that I actually have a large audience in that way. And I've done it with other stuff with, you know, homosexuality and how that I try to make a very pragmatic argument and just been torn to pieces. People wrote me some awful emails and, you know, all kinds of things. But recognizing that that's part of the advocacy and that's part of my ability. I have that platform and I can do that. So happy to hear any ideas and thoughts that my colleagues might have about the personal challenges of advocacy, yes, particularly in a space that's highly Christian.
Yeah, and I'll just add that from a direct service standpoint, I think, you know, one question again that Carly Daniel Hughes says that really resonated with me was this question of like, why are so many evangelical women drawn to, you know, the anti-trafficking space? And what I find, you know, just as I am a trainer of volunteers, like, you know, dozens of volunteers every year who come to serve in our organization, and this is the population that is showing up very, very often. And so I think what many of these chapters provide is not just the like, here's what not to do, because I think we have a lot of that, but I think there is actually kind of, as Lauren was mentioning earlier, the question that Yvonne posed to her, I think there are actually some tangible things to offer direct service providers here of how to, you know, what posture to take. And even, you know, in that chapter 1 of like just sitting with your sexual ethic, like just sit with that, you know, and the notion of just introspection. And I think, yeah, complex agency, playing with complexity, from Lauren's chapter, so many, I feel like I'm still harvesting from each chapter, and I'm looking forward to just frankly like tweaking some of my training materials to include some of your contributions and voices, so that we're doing better work, because I really think it will have just great bearing on what service provision looks like.
I've got to say that really touches me, because when we set off on this journey, the publisher asks you to think about what is the purpose of your book. And for me, one of the purposes was to impact service delivery. So to hear that that's actually happening across the world, like Beatrice, you're training up ministers to take a different approach. And Hannah, you're doing the same thing. I mean, yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm very moved.
We have only just a few minutes left, but I don't want to lose track of Anna's question. And I want to make a little space for others to respond to that, because your question, Anna, it connects in my mind to a couple of other points that have been raised. And one of them is the point that Lauren makes in her chapter about stigma, not just attaching to sex workers and people who are involved in commercial sex, but to advocates and people who are in community with those sex workers. So it connects to that. And it also connects in my mind to some of the themes, Yvonne, that you write about in your chapter, which is really exploring how do people work together across very deep divisions of, you know, ideological difference. And you know, I just want to see if anyone has other things they want to add to this question about how do we bring this conversation to a wider audience, you know, and Hannah, you've talked about the audience of people who are volunteers, who are attracted to the space and thinking about that. But what about people who their immediate response is that the conversation has to be shut down because the conversation itself represents a kind of threat?
I just want to say, you know, Anna, you are a pioneer in a way. You're out in front. So I'm sorry that you're getting all that negative feedback, but you are opening new pathways in your nation. That is very hard work, actually, very hard work. And yeah, I guess, you know, having that support around you and the relationships that build you up and keep you empowered to keep going is probably, it's really crucial. And I think moving into that and then continuing to focus on those relational developments and just that safety with people who do feel threatened in this conversation, creating safe space to begin to unpack very, very slowly, I think is always the way forward. That's been my experience anyway, that it doesn't happen very quickly, this change that we're seeking, but it is always through one-on-one and group relationship as well, where you can present the truth and that complexity of what you're thinking and working with. So I congratulate you, Anna, on doing that. That's amazing. And I hope we can be here for you to keep empowering you as well.
Yeah. I wasn't here for the question, but it reminds me of when I went to one school and I was doing the presentation, and one student asked me whether I am one of them. That's why you know, it's like I'm advocating. So am I one of them? But so you get all this negative attitude and feedback and all that. But I think once you are dedicated to the cause of, you know what you want and what you are doing, and looking at the end goal, it will be tough, but you hang in there. I think, you are breaking new grounds. So,
Yeah, thank you. And I'll add my voice to that and say you really are breaking new ground. And I actually look forward to learning from you about how it is that you're navigating stepping out into those conversations in the Caribbean context that you're in, because I think we all have a lot to learn from that, that will apply in our own contexts in different ways as well.
Sure. With the kind of support that you all are offering, plus obviously support that I know I have at home with friends like Jane and other allies, I'm sure we'll take some tiny steps, even if it just means that we stop saying prostitute and we say sex worker. That'll be a step.
Yeah. Well, we're wrapping up our time here. I want to invite Lauren to have the last word and to close out the panel. And I'll start by saying thank you for bringing this volume together and for sticking with it through a very challenging season globally, and seeing it through to completion. It's a really wonderful piece of work. And so I'll give you the floor to close us out.
Oh, thank you, Letitia. I'm not sure what to say other than, I guess when I think this is a lifelong passion for me, you know, and we're at this point now where we're publishing and we're making changes in the structures in our society in large and big ways here, both individually and as a group. And I just think this is really amazing what we've achieved and what we're moving into next. So I really thank you for being part of this and for being really open to editorial comments and to making changes and to really doing the work. Every chapter has such great value to offer, and just together, it's such a strong piece. So I'm really impressed, I'm really amazed, and I'm really grateful to you all. And I want to stay in touch and keep supporting and learning and talking.
Thank you.
But yes, thank you.
All right. What we have now is both Lauren McGraw, who is the editor of the book, Religious Responses to Sex Work and Sex Trafficking, and myself are here. So if there are any questions in the queue from the audience you want to put in the Q&A feature at the bottom, that would be great. We would be willing to, we have a few minutes that we'd be able to take the time to answer those questions. One question that Lauren has come in for you as the editor of the book would be if you could talk about what you would say that you feel like your primary learning or your primary takeaway is from the international nature of the conversation. Because certainly one of the, there's two, as I see it, there's two real contributions of this book to the field. One is that piece that you said at the beginning about sort of work on that question of what are the new practices that we should be doing and developing in response to sex work and human trafficking that involves sexual exploitation. And also, in addition to that sort of new practices, the fact that this came from a truly international collection of authors and contributors. And so since you are the one as the editor who sort of has the bird's eye view of that, I wonder if you could speak to that question a little bit.
That's such a great question. I think what resonates now after being part of all those chapters from many different countries is that there is actually a lot of similarity in sex work status across the world. There's quite specific moral codes that are utilised and enforced in an oppressive way against both women and men in many different nations. So that, yeah, I guess that consistent theme is there throughout. Another learning that I've taken, and I keep going back to the chapter by the African authors Beatrice, Maggie and Sophia, and just those really grounded interviews with hundreds of people in the sex industry that they've done. And just their voices are so powerful in presenting a really a moral challenge to the church. And it's so strong in that here we are surviving, we're doing everything we can to survive, and that is our moral task in the world, and yet you judge us for this. And I just, that question that's come from really some of the most marginalized people in the world, I just think it just resonates so powerfully. And for me, that is holding space for that question in the world really is what I'm learning to do. So that's really the heart of what's come out of this book for me. And I think just watching that video again, we can support each other in our different places and different times. And countries are speaking, like looking at different nations. We are at different places in terms of the law and in terms of the influence of the church in society. And yet we can come together and build each other up. So that's another learning for me in how to go about doing that well. What about you, Yvonne? Can you answer that one too?
Oh, yeah. You know, I think I think that for me, one of the main takeaways from that book and having so many really distinct and distinctive perspectives on a topic is amazing. But one of my main takeaways that came out, I was taking some notes as we were going through the discussion, was I think that one of the features that occurs to me, if I think about sort of when I started on this set of issues back in the early 2000s till today, almost 20 years later, is that at that time there were really two options for Christian response, and that was to rescue or reject, and there was, I think, a sense that there needed to be at least a third way, maybe a fourth and a fifth and a sixth as well, but sort of this like that those two options were inadequate responses. And so I see now like all of the authors who we just heard from talking about how the importance of recognition. Again, I'm going to come back to something I offered in the panel, sort of talking about the recognition of complex agency, but that sort of represents a third kind of response that doesn't require one to either default to either the rescue paradigm or the rejection and judgment paradigm, but also allows one to respond and engage in a different kind of way. And of course, that's always context specific, which again goes back to why it is so important to have so many different people from so many different places navigating different kinds of specific contextual contingencies as part of the conversation, because we really can, like you said, we can learn from each other, that we can be sort of that rich conversation allows for spaces of creativity. We can learn from each other and we can support each other, even sometimes when that support isn't about offering specific recommendations, but about saying like, yeah, what you're doing or what you're experiencing is really hard, or like, yes, I see the like mechanisms of stigmatization that are in place around what you're doing, and that you're becoming, an object of stigma. Even to have another person recognize when that's happening to you can be the kind of thing that can really open up some space for to breathe and to work and to move. And so that's one of that I think is a huge contribution that this book and this very international conversation of scholars and practitioners really offers.
That's wonderful. That to me is success in academia. If we can take it to a place where it is actually a rich conversation and supportive and learning and breaking things down and doing that in a grassroots way across nations. I think that's just wonderful. We've left the ivory tower behind.
Yeah. There is a question from the audience, and I'm going to read the question because it's directed to you, Lauren. It says, Dr. Monroe, can you talk a bit more about power dynamics in your context? You mentioned Aboriginal peoples and their oft challenging interactions with non-Native people, for example.
Yeah. Okay, well, just a bit more of what I've written about that is often from what I've seen in organisations in Australia and with individual practitioners is that they hold power socially in terms that they're often white and conservative, highly educated, middle class, well respected for the work that they're doing, and then they're in say an organisation that has some funding and backup from churches and a lot of respect from other organisations of a similar ilk, and then correlating with that is that they are then working with people who, maybe Aboriginal, maybe English might not be a first language, and people who are often disrespected socially and don't have a lot of money and may be struggling with things like mental illness or homelessness, or plus the stigma of sex work. So the power dynamic is almost like a seesaw, you know. It's someone who's really disempowered in our social context, and then a practitioner who is very, very powerful in that context. So for me, and then a lot of that is also unspoken, you know, that's not readily acknowledged, particularly by faith-based organisations. And power is difficult to speak about, particularly for those with the power and the privilege. It can be uncomfortable to unpack that. So for me, just thinking that through, and, you know, how do you rebalance that power? And a lot of that is giving up or making room for other people to make decisions about what happens in these organisations. It's about the people who are actually using these organisations having a say in how funding is spent. You know, it's really letting go of some of that social power and the feel-good power that comes from, you know, doing good in the world, and just sort of trying to work that through with in the presence of and in conversation with people who are very disempowered. I just saw that there is not a lot of open and frank discussion about this in organisations, and want us to readdress that. So yeah, it is an opening conversation here amongst these organisations in Australia. I don't think we're there yet. And that's why I've put it in my work. I want that conversation to open a bit more. So I guess that's how I would answer that. Yeah, the power dynamics in our context. I think another answer there is, and I referenced this in the talk, that there's a monopoly of faith-based organisations in Australia that provide services, and they are receiving millions and millions of dollars from the Australian government, and they're highly respected organisations. And there is a lot of power for them in this nation, and they have a lot of political sway. And I would like to see them sort of talk about that a bit more and start to readdress that power, because really, if they are, you know, Christian organisations, then power is something, and how power is used is something that's integral to the Christian faith, particularly if you look at Jesus and his challenge to the powerful. And I don't see that on an organisational level here, and I'd like to see that. Thank you for the question.
I know we need to be moving towards wrapping up, but the final question, I wonder if you would talk a little bit about, Lauren, and this is just my personal question for you, is what's next? What is next for you following the publication of this book? Do you have a sense of where your research, your activism, your thought is moving?
Well, I've got to say, I've started progress on advocacy around decriminalisation of sex work in the state where I live. I've realised it's not going to be as easy as I was hoping. But that's okay. It's these big law changes aren't easy, I guess. It's a matter of timing and working with different groups to get this on board. So I've made some connections with legal firms and with the police, and we're going to try and look at the loitering laws and how successful the law has been. So for me right now, I'm sort of stepping back into the history of sex work in my own state and what's been and how we can bring change. And again, as I said in that video, this is a lifelong journey for me. So I guess this is the next phase of it, committing to bring change in another very practical way here, and knowing that it's probably not going to happen this year. This could be years of work in getting this changed.
Well, thank you. I know that I, for one, will be watching to see not only what you do, but how you do it, because certainly my experience in working with you on multiple projects over time is that you are a force. So wishing you the best in that. So I think with that, I want to thank everybody who has joined us this evening and who is watching later on the recording. Thank you for being with us this evening and tuning in for this panel. We appreciate it, and we wish you a good night. Thank you so much.